Welcome to the second video in Portrait Drawing the Smart Way, brought to you by thevirtualinstructor.com. The Skull Frontal View. The artist must understand the subject, not always to a technical degree, but in a manner that informs decisions about light, shadow, and form. Often, this understanding goes beyond what is seen and extends to what is unseen. The structure of the face and head lies in what is beneath it, the skull. This is where our understanding should begin. When we draw the skull, we better understand how its structure greatly influences the face and the head. When we study how light reacts based on its form, we can better anticipate what will happen with the often subtle changes in value that occur on the face. In this module and the next, we'll spend some time drawing the human skull, paying close attention to the recesses and protrusions of the form and how light behaves in these areas. We'll also begin to familiarize ourselves with the locations of the features at the structural level. We'll begin by drawing a line from the top of the skull to the bottom of the skull. This will ensure that we get the entire drawing on the surface of the paper. Then we'll look at the cranium section of the skull and draw a circle to represent that. We're drawing lightly at the beginning stages using an HB pencil. Then we'll draw a line from the bottom of that circle extending to the bottom portion of the skull, right down the center of the front of the face. From here, we can begin to draw the observed contour lines. As you draw these lines, focus on the organic nature of these lines. They aren't rigid or geometric. Instead, they bend and curve at unexpected points. As we work, we can make comparisons between the overall shape of the skull and the negative shapes around the skull. This will help to ensure that the contour lines that we're drawing are as accurate as possible. Once we've defined the overall shape of the skull, we can draw a line across the brow line. This will give us a good indication of where to place the orbital cavities, which will exist right underneath the brow line. By making comparisons with the outside portions of the skull, we can draw the orbital cavities in place. We'll also pay special attention to the distance between each one of the orbital cavities. This location does have an arrangement of values, but we're only concentrating on the contour lines at this point. With the orbital cavities in place, we can use them to position the nasal cavity, which happens just underneath the orbital cavities. The top portion of the nasal cavity will reach just slightly above a line drawn from the bottom portions of the orbital cavities. Then with the nasal cavity in place, we can use its positioning to make comparisons on where certain contour lines should be drawn for the lower portion of the skull. A line is drawn for the upper portion of the teeth, where the teeth meet the lower portion of the skull. We'll also draw a line for where the top teeth meet the bottom teeth. At first, this is just a line to indicate some separation. We'll go back and add a bit more interest and detail to the individual teeth in a moment. At this point, we're only concerned with the overall height of the teeth, both the top teeth and the lower teeth. With the majority of the contour lines in place, I'm going to go back and map out the locations of value. I'm concentrating at this point in the areas of high contrast, in other words, locations where we have a dark value next to a lighter value. This process also includes going back and defining each individual tooth. This is because these locations are defined by a contrast in value. And now that our contour lines are in place, we can go back with a kneaded eraser and clean up any stray marks. Now we're ready to start adding the value. Initially, I'm going to start with a 4B pencil, which of course is a softer lead, which is going to produce a darker mark. I'm also going to concentrate on trying to make most of my lines follow a diagonal direction. This will add a bit of consistency and unity to the piece. Now, this is not possible in all areas. In some locations, you will have to change the direction of the shading that you add to the drawing. And if you do have to do that, it's best to follow the cross contours of the form of the skull. It's important to note that at this point we're only concentrating on the darker values within the scene. We'll go back at a later stage and add the highlights and the lighter values using white charcoal. This is also just an initial application of darker value. We can clean up edges and make the value a bit more precise with subsequent applications. And as you work, be mindful of the fact that while it's a lot easier to go darker, it's very difficult to go lighter. So it's best to keep your drawing as light as possible and progressively get darker as you become more confident with the areas of shading. Alright, now we're going to go back and we're going to start to blend some of these applications. I'm using a blending tortilla for this, and I'm trying to make my marks go in a circular motion as I apply the blending stump to the surface. This will create a smooth gradation or a smooth change in value from darker values to lighter values. Now, in all areas, of course, this is not possible to create that circular motion, so you may find yourself pulling the marks in the direction of the cross contour lines, just as we did with the graphite applications. Once our initial application of graphite is blended into the surface, we'll return back to the 4B pencil and repeat the process. We'll add a bit of graphite to the surface and then return back to the blending stump, working it into the surface, creating a smoother transition. Now in the end, our entire drawing will not be smudged using the blending stump. This is again just a base layer of value. We're going to continue to add applications on top of this, and some of the applications will not be blended at all with the blending stump. Some beginning artists find that they become frustrated while using a blending stump because they blend the entire image, when there really should be a harmony between blended areas and non-blended areas. But let's return back to value. If you're having trouble seeing the value in an image, you may squint at it and try to reduce it to just several locations of value. In this image, I have reduced the image of the skull to extreme locations of value, where we have 4 different values: a white area, a lighter gray or medium gray area, a darker gray area, and then black. These locations of value can be considered a highlight in the area of lightest value, a midtone in the areas of middle values, and then of course shadows, areas of darker value. It's the relationship of these locations of value that ultimately lead to the illusion of light within the scene and the illusion of form and texture on the subject. As our work of adding darker values continues to the right side of the skull, which is closest to the light source, you may notice that there are less areas of darker value. This, of course, is because it is closer to the light source. The exception, of course, is in the orbital cavity. There will still be a good amount of darker values that exist within this orbital cavity. A quick note here on the order in which I've been working. You may have noticed that I'm working in small areas at a time. Of course, you're free to apply the entire application of graphite and then go back and work it into the surface with the blending stop. I've also been working from the upper left-hand corner down to the lower right-hand corner, and this is simply because I'm right-handed and I'm trying to keep the palm of my hand out of the way so that I don't smear any of the material. Of course, this can be alleviated or prevented altogether by placing a sheet of paper underneath the palm of your hand or perhaps a paper towel. We'll add a bit of darker value on the right side of the skull, and you may be thinking, isn't this the area from which the light source is originating? And you're right, it is. But this area also recedes back away from the viewer. Typically, areas that recede are going to be darker in value, while areas that protrude will be lighter in value. This will be an important concept to keep in mind as we go through this portrait series. Typically, when locations protrude, they're able to pick up more light, and this makes them lighter in value. An example of this is on the bridge of the nose or the upper portions of the cheeks, where areas that recede usually have the tendency to create locations of shadow. We see this on the bottom portion and underneath the nose, as well as the recesses of the eyes. We can see this clearly in the drawing of the skull with the orbital cavities. With the last bits of our darker values added and blended into place, we're ready to turn our attention to the lighter values or the highlighted locations on the skull. We're going to address these with a white compressed charcoal pencil. Initially, these values will be very strong on the surface, but we're also going to work those in with a blending stop. Here again, we won't blend all the areas with a blending stop. Instead, we'll apply the material, blend with a blending stop, and then in some cases go back and allow the pencil to rest on the surface without any additional blending. In some areas, we're going to allow the gray of the paper to work for us. Instead of addressing all the areas with either dark graphite or light charcoal, we're going to allow the color of the paper to show through. This will create areas of midtones in between the lights and the darks. If we were working on a white surface, the bulk of our efforts would be centered around creating darker values and pushing the values as dark as possible. The advantage, of course, to working on a neutral tone surface like this with a neutral gray is that we start with a neutral base from which we can push the lighter and darker values, creating a more harmonious relationship between the values. We can also see contrast in values initially. When we add the white here, we've got a better understanding of the full range of tonality that we're adding to the drawing. As mentioned before, areas that recede typically are darker in value, while areas that protrude are lighter in value. This means a lot of the areas that we add the white charcoal to are areas that protrude. We can start to get accustomed to the areas of the face that protrude by looking at the skull. Areas on the bridge of the nose, of course, area on the lower brow portion, areas on the top portion of the skull, and the lower portions of the chin. Now, of course, on a face, there is a bit of skin and tissue that happen on the cheeks that usually make these areas protrude as well. Of course, as we add the white charcoal to the surface, you'll start to see the drawing come to life. And this is mainly because you're creating a full range of value on the surface, and you're also defining the relationships of contrast between value. It's important to note that we also want variety in the lighter values, just as we want variety in the darker values. Therefore, when we add the white charcoal and work it into the surface, we may decide to go back in areas and make the light a bit more intense, by making marks without any blending at all. Of course, as I mentioned before, this leads to harmony and unity within the piece and leads to a more successful drawing. Just as details can be added with dark material, they can also be added with light material. As you can see here, I've added an indication of a fissure within the skull by using a white defined line. We'll also add a bit of the white charcoal inside of the orbital cavities as well, since this will make those locations a bit more natural. And of course, as we add the areas of highlight on the teeth with the white charcoal, the teeth start to make a bit more sense and really come to life, so to speak. At this point, we've added the majority of light value and we're ready to go back and clean things up a bit and make a few of the details a bit more defined. We can accomplish this by going back to the HB pencil instead of the 4B pencil. Because the HB pencil is a bit stronger, meaning the lead doesn't dull as easily, we can go back and add details with ease. This means that we can even darken up areas that need to be a bit darker in value, but this time a bit more precisely. This includes some of the sinuses that happen on the skull, as well as some defining of different locations of darker value. We can also use the sharp tip of this pencil to define edges of things, for example, around the inside portion of the orbital cavities and the nasal cavity, even around the teeth and the bottom portion of the teeth. We can use this sharp, precise pencil to make these areas a bit darker, increasing the contrast between light and dark values while keeping a sharp, defined edge. One thing that we need to consider when using this combination of media is that the white charcoal will not necessarily cover over the top of graphite applications, and the same can be true about the graphite. It cannot cover over the top of applications of white charcoal. Therefore, as you apply your value applications, whether they be lighter values or darker values, you need to leave enough space on the surface for them. In other words, as you're applying darker applications with the graphite, don't assume that you can go back with a lighter application of white charcoal over the top. And with a few final finishing touches, our drawing of a skull from a frontal view is complete. So what did we discuss in this module? We took a look at drawing the skull from a frontal view. We learned that the structure of the head and face is greatly influenced by the skull. We paid attention to the manner in which light behaves in the recesses and on the protrusions of the structure, which will carry over into portrait drawing. In the next module of this series, we'll continue taking a look at the skull, but from the side view.